She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. She opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny, of a people, with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery. She challenged it with burning eyes and black skin, torn skin, whipped skin, degraded skin, smashed skin, dehumanized skin, dehumanized skin.
Good morning, all. And, yesterday I opened with the AP story, and other outlets were reporting that President Biden was on his long-promised sub-Saharan African tour. And yesterday I asked the question, why there, why now, why so late at the end of the administration? And I want to get back to this because I think it is still incredibly relevant, and I wanted to get my guest's take on it today. Why is this still relevant? Well, folks, let's connect some dots and let's find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand and appreciate the broader historical context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze these events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is Biden's on his way out, Trump's on his way back. What's in store? My guest is the chair of the Coordinating Committee for the Black Alliance for Peace and editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report, and he was the Green Party candidate for Vice President of the United States in 2016, none other than Ajamu Baraka. My dear brother, welcome back.
Be back with you.
Thank you, man. I really, really appreciate you joining us. So yesterday, I was joined by Gerald Pereira, and we talked, and so I wanted to get your take on this. President Biden is now on this long-promised sub-Saharan African tour, and I didn't really hear anybody in the mainstream asking, why there? Why now? Why so late, since this thing was long awaited? We're at the end of the administration. Ajamu.
Well, I think as some of the critics already pointed out, it just reflects the real attitude. Well, two things: the real attitude that this administration had vis-a-vis Africa, but even more importantly, the second point is that the recognition that the preferred strategy to try to maintain U.S. Control, influence, hegemony on the African continent was the use of military force, of creating chaos, of creating security issues that would justify and rationalize U.S. physical presence on the African continent. That strategy has been a failure. And I think there's been a recognition among some in the foreign policy community that they had to make a shift. Now, one reason why they didn't want to make a shift and have an approach similar to the approach of the Russians and the Chinese, I think, Dr. Leon, is reflective of the inability to overcome what I call the psychopathology of white supremacy. That is, they did not want to have to deal with these African states as equals, to deal with them in ways in which they weren't used to, because the Europeans, and particularly the U.S. specifically, they have an issue with that. They absolutely need. I don't like delving into the non-material that often, but some of this stuff you almost are compelled to do that. They have an inability to deal with non-European states except as subordinates, but not just as subordinates, but subordinates that have been degraded to the point where they will offer no resistance to their policies, to their control, and to their influence. And so by pursuing a strategy similar to the Chinese of having to work with, negotiate, provide support to these states that will allow them to use the leverage that they have with their natural resources, land, materials, minerals, et cetera, they preferred a strategy that would freeze these African states in these subordinate positions. So they were very, very reluctant to pursue that kind of strategy until recently, where people have finally come to the conclusion that you're not going to bomb and murder your way into hegemony on the African continent. You've got to explore other approaches. And so this investment project that they're involved in Angola, and Zambia, and Southern Congo, that the Biden administration is attempting to highlight represents the U.S. sort of sticking their toe in the water of a different kind of approach to African relations. And it remains to be seen if in fact it's too late. I mean, the fact that he's doing this a month before he leaves office, it should be seen as an embarrassment. But of course, when you are operating from the point of view, from the framework of the cognitive deficiencies of white racism, you may not see it that way.
A couple of things to that point. One, historically, the United States doesn't negotiate. The United States dictates. And
Exactly.
and so even when they claim to be at the table negotiating, they've already said to you, you are going to capitulate on the front end before we agree to sit down and have any type of conversation. And to me, an example of that was Tony Blinken in Anchorage, Alaska, with the Chinese delegation I think it was the first year of the Biden administration, where
First few
China,
months.
okay,
First few months. Yeah.
China looked at Tony Blinken and said, "Man, what are you doing? We're not going to sit here and listen to this from you. We're China, damn it. And
Right.
you need to be listening to us. We don't sit here and take this from you." Also, some people take this reference as being rather trite, but it's actually a stated policy by China, and that is the win-win strategy.
Yes.
China's approach to relationships is win-win. China comes in, they build roads, they build airports. The United States comes in, they build military bases.
And the relationship is always extraction by the U.S.,
Correct.
taking the value from these peoples and these nations and giving back very little except propping up their local comprador allies, the local ruling classes, to make sure that that dependent relationship continues. And so the Chinese say this is not sustainable. And they have been able to approach some of those same comprador classes, uh, but in a different kind of way, allowing them, of course, to be propped up and to engage in some degree of national development, while at the same time the Chinese are benefiting from their national development in terms of these trade relationships. So this has been the approach of the Chinese, and the approach of the U.S. has been completely different. Let me make another point in terms of why I make the argument that this is a reluctant strategy now on the part of the U.S. We talked about this before on other programs, Dr. Leon. The Just a couple of years ago, what was the piece of legislation that the U.S. was attempting to use to impose its dominance on the African continent and to undermine African states that may be considering expanding their relationships to Russia, for example? It was the countering malign
Russian
activities.
Activities Act, yes.
Yes, which was a racist piece of legislation, basically intruding on the sovereignty of these African states, telling them, you are not going to be allowed to expand relations with Russia. That if you do that, then you can count on us, in fact, being your enemy. And it was passed and served as the framework, the opening conversation, if you will, to the gathering that the Biden administration organized to bring in these African states to talk about U.S.-Africa relations. But they did it with such a heavy hand because right before that meeting occurred, the U.S. was able to arrange the prosecution of officials in Zimbabwe, again showing that they were going to use their muscle to, in fact, intimidate Russia, to intimidate African states into compliance with their rules and regulations. So that's always been their approach. And again, it's only been recently that they have finally come to the conclusion that this is not going to be a winnable approach in Africa and really anywhere else.
One other data point that I think is important for people to add as they start to do some analysis about China. China has a 4,000-year history. They have a culture that is over 4,000 years old. And so, and this applies not only to the Chinese, it applies to Russia, it applies to Iran. When you're dealing with countries that and cultures and societies that are thousands and thousands of years old, they have a different perspective on, as Dr. King called it, the moral arc of history. And so whereas the United States, is in knee-jerk reaction mode, China and these other cultures, they plan 10 years out. They plan 15, 20, 25 years out. They're planning. And so that makes them much more nimble, much more able to make adjustments to what they consider to be minor blips in the road. I think it was Mao who was asked sometime in the mid 60s what he thought of the French Revolution, and his answer was, "It's still too early to tell."
Exactly, it was, yeah.
So I think that people in the United States is almost 250 years old.
Is it even that? Yeah, so
248. 248.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. A baby nation, basically,
compared to 4,000. That's a hard score. That's a hard score to equate.
But you connect that also too, Dr. Leon. Not only the U.S. being a relatively new nation, a created nation out of a settler colonial project, but then you connect that to Europe as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the 500 years of European dominance, global dominance, and compare that to other empires in human history.
Correct.
It's a blip. It
Right.
is a moment. Okay. Now it's been an extraordinarily significant one in terms of the assaults on humanity and culture, but it's been only 500 and something years, and right now, as that European dominance is declining, in precipitous decline, as a matter of fact, we're seeing the extraordinary, the almost desperate acts on the part of the West to try to maintain this hegemony, to the extent that they appear to be prepared to blow up the entire world. So this effort on the part of Biden in Africa is part of that attempt, a desperate attempt, using other means besides the military to try to counter the Chinese, counter the Russians. But it appears to be a little bit too little and too late, and even limited. I mean, if you look at this, the project, is to support this rail line, linking up Angola with Zambia and with Southern Congo. But what's the objective? It is to link up with these mines, these copper mines, and other minerals, in order to facilitate the extraction of those minerals from Africa back to the U.S. This is classic colonialism. You look at before the process of so-called decolonization in Africa, and you look at the little bit of development that took place on the African continent, it looked very similar. Rail lines that will start in the areas where they had agricultural production, or primarily a mining production, mm-hmm. straight to the closest port, and then back to Europe. So they're trying to replicate to a certain extent what the Chinese are doing, but even in a more limited kind of way.
Let's switch gears a bit here. Joe Biden's pardon of his son Hunter is spurring discussions amongst many, not only about that particular pardon, but who else should be considered for clemency. And Joe Biden was asked during the campaign whether he would pardon his son, and he was very emphatic and very clear in saying no. And my issue with this is not the pardon in and of itself, because as a parent, you're a parent. If you have the opportunity to protect your child, short of being an axe murderer, you're going to protect your child. Plus, if Joe hadn't done this for Hunter, he'd have had a real hard time with Jill sitting at the dinner table, looking at that empty chair at Christmas, or looking at that empty chair if the incoming Trump administration were successful in pursuing him. So I understand the pardon. It's two things. One, Joe, you lied to me on the front end as though we didn't know you would do this. As my dad would say, oh, so now you think I'm stupid. And the other thing I think is important for people to look at was Joe not only pardoning Hunter, but was Joe pardoning himself? Because if the Trump administration were to get in the digs and start really digging this stuff up on Hunter Biden, remember the 10% for the big guy. Who was the big guy? Ajamu.
Well, when you shared that I thought that was very fascinating. That's an element that I think many people probably miss in terms of the implications for Joe Biden himself, and that with this pardon, that in fact takes away that possibility of him being legally vulnerable, it appears. But another piece of this too, we can come back to that, but another piece of this too that I find fascinating in terms of the reaction to the pardon on the part primarily of Democrats. Of course, Republicans use it as another example of the hypocrisy of liberals. But what I find fascinating is these neoliberals and liberals actually thought that Joe Biden was going to sacrifice his son to a prosecution that I agree with the Republicans was politically motivated. That if Hunter Biden's last name wasn't Biden, that those charges would not have resulted in any kind of jail time or whatever. They would have been basically sort of either dismissed or probation at most. Okay. And in fact, you remember that the trial that they had and the deal that was struck with the prosecution to in fact do that was pulled at the very last moment. Why? Again, because of political considerations. The idea was, if you all strike this deal and Biden gets off, how do you then legitimately argue that the prosecutions that you are involved in right now toward targeting Donald Trump is fair? It would undermine your argument that, quote unquote, no one is above the law. Okay. And so because they did not want to undermine what they thought was a very effective political weapon against Trump, they basically had that agreement pulled, and they were prepared to allow Hunter to be sentenced and basically to go to jail. But I think in the back of Biden's mind, he knew that as long as he was president, that in fact was not going to happen. So, but people should understand that. That's why it's so amazing that people actually are upset that he's not going to allow his son to go to prison for them.
Right. Absolutely right. And Bill Clinton pardoned his brother.
Yes.
Donald Trump pardoned Jared Kushner's father, who was a convicted felon. And now Joe is pardoning his son. And one of the things that this highlights to me as well is still how tone deaf Democrats are, because they keep telling us they need us. They keep telling us the black vote is critical to their success. They're not talking about pardoning Mumia. They're not talking about pardoning Assata Shakur. They're not even talking about posthumously pardoning Marcus Garvey. They won't give us a damn thing of substance, but keep telling us they need us, and then you've got people like Kamala Harris and what's his name, Hakeem Jeffries, who want to keep telling us about how important our loyalty is and all of those kinds of things.
Not only will they not get partners from this administration and this party, but it's quite clear that the Democrats have decided that they're going, not only are they going to continue to go to the right, they're going white. That they're upset with the fact that for the first time, I'll argue for the first real time, you had Black folks inside their party to assert themselves when became absolutely clear that once the big donors orchestrated the coup against Biden, that they were prepared to also jettison Kamala Harris. And Black folks were like, oh, no, no, oh, no, we're not going to allow that. You know, if y'all want to get rid of Biden, okay, but we're not going to allow you to disrespect, in a way, us by just bringing in who we know y'all want to bring in, which was Gavin Newsom, and go white. No, no, we're not going to allow that. And so they were forced to take on Harris. And the result was, of course, this loss. And that's why you see these articles and these discussions around how wokeism and identity politics and all of that once again undermine the Democrat Party. And that the solution to that is to go to the right, to continue the march to the right. But this time, tell Black folks once again, indirectly, that basically y'all had your moment. Y'all had Barack Obama. For a couple of months, you had Kamala Harris. It's time for you all to reassume your position at the back of the bus and come out and vote when we tell you to vote. We give some of your so-called leaders prominent positions, but we go in another direction. And either you get on board or you do something else. And it appears that some of these Black folks, this mixed leadership class, have decided that their pocketbooks are more important than the dignity of Black folks, and they're going to go get on board and allow them to move their party to the right. Even after, like what you just said, Dr. Leon, the Democrat Party should be a Black party.
Right.
The base of that party is the Black folks and the Black vote. And you have these Black leaders who are in positions in ways that have never been before, but they won't assert themselves because politically and ideologically, they're not in alignment with Black folks and the interests of Black folks, in particular Black workers. They are more in alignment with the interests of their donor class, the big capitalists.
And I also should have mentioned the name of Leonard Peltier. He's another one whose pardon needs to be granted. And let's spend, if we could, just a couple of minutes on what I think was a great opportunity missed with this election, and that is a lot of people said, well, we've got the binary choice of the lesser of two evils. We've got Trump or we've got Harris, and very few people wanted to discuss the third party option. Again, looking at the long game, looking at the long view, because I believe if the Stein-Ware ticket had gotten 10%, 11%, that would have seriously had an impact on people's analysis of reality and would have given an incredible amount of impetus and momentum to a third party discussion.
Exactly. But they've been very effective with this lesser of two evilism approach, in particular with the scare tactics related to Donald Trump and his supposed threat to democracy. And I mean, some of the responses have been almost hysterical, that this will be the last election, stock up on cans because the country's going to collapse, and some people actually believe that. So therefore, even though they were disgusted with the Democrats and Democrat policy, the objective fact that there was nothing for the Democrats to really run on that they can point to in terms of major legislation that had an impact on people's lives, in particular working class people. They still were afraid of the possibility of a Trump administration. At least many of them were. Clearly, that strategy wasn't working like it used to, because you had these defections, if you will, over to the Trump campaign among all Black folks, in particular, though, Black men, Latinos, um, and still a large section of the working class, and also Black workers. So the 9 million votes that they lost in 2012, they've never really been able to recover from the white working class, and now you have even more who are flocked over to Trump. And what was the motivation? Well, the Democrats' operatives will tell you is only because they are deplorables, they're racist, and many of them are. But you can't use that simplistic explanation to come to terms with what is happening with people in the country, with workers. Why this kind of brand of right-wing populism has been successful for Donald Trump. If you only believe that it's because people are confused, because you are telling them that the economy is better, but they're experiencing something else, then you're going to keep on making the same kinds of mistakes that they made. And when you try to tell yourself that people weren't disgusted, outraged by the policies that led to this ongoing war in Ukraine, but more importantly, this genocide that was brought to their attention and they had to be exposed to for months, that was taking place and is taking place in Gaza. That element they don't want to even look at in terms of the possibility of helping to explain why you had the millions of people who did not vote, and many more who voted for Trump, not because they thought Trump's policies on Gaza was going to be better, but as a protest vote, a punishment, if you will, against the Democrats for initiating and enabling that process.
And final point on all of this, I've been wanting to get your take on this analysis. As I have been talking, I wrote this piece, Requiem for a Failed Candidate and Party. And in it, I was making the point that to say that Vice President Harris lost because of misogyny and, she was a Black woman. And I said, that's just too simplistic and wrong. In terms of the gender issue, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 with 45 million votes. She lost the Electoral College, but she won the popular vote. And Kamala Harris got almost like 10 million more votes than Hillary got. In terms of the fact she's Black, well, Barack Obama won twice. So I know that's not a Black woman, but you get my point.
Right.
So I was making the point, well, she didn't say anything. She didn't have substantive policy. And the retort is, well, Trump didn't have any either. To which I say two things, and this is what I'd like for you to speak to. One, he didn't have to articulate policy because he knew the base he was appealing to, and he stuck to his base. Kamala ran from her base. She got her Liz's confused. Instead of Liz Cheney, she needed to be with Elizabeth Warren. And she ran from her base with no policy. Don't compare her to an idiot, because that will never get you anywhere. Ajamu Baraka.
I agree. I mean, with the premise of that question, that basically the Democrats had nothing to run on. They had the ability to be able to run on something if they would have passed those significant portions of the Build Back Better Act, where they could have run on the fact that they had a permanent child tax credit that lifted millions of people, kids, out of poverty, that they could have had enacted paid sick and maternity leave, that they could have had talked about the fact that now community college was free, and that there was going to be help for a working class that has to pay for childcare with the pre-K programs and the support for childcare that was in that piece of legislation. But they didn't pass that because that was something that their donors, their capitalist donors, were not in favor of.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, what did they run on? What did Harris run on? Some a tax credit for purchasing homes, and some other crap that I can't
which wasn't going to work.
No, and some other stuff that I can't even remember off the top of my head. They were so unimpactful. And so, what, as you said, and what was Trump saying? Trump was saying basically, by implication and directly, I'm going to bring you all some economic relief. First, let me remind you of the economy when I was in office before COVID. And let me also point your attention to this bogus position, but nevertheless something that resonated. We can't completely bring back the economy, build the economy the way it should be, because of the influx, the invasion of all of these illegal workers who are coming to the country, who have driven down wages, who've taken your black jobs, who are engaged in criminal activity. And the result is that you got black folks in various parts of the country spouting this racist, xenophobic nonsense in ways even more aggressive than we've ever seen white folks do. And so there was this appeal to irrationality, and it was what these kind of right-wing populists do, and it became effective. And the Democrats had nothing to counter because they couldn't counter with a straight up working class counter because that's not their positions. And Kamala Harris, being guided by the same a political consultants that led Hillary Clinton to defeat, was listening to these folks. And as you said, instead of them digging deep into their base, going to those disaffected workers, developing a campaign that was going to center the interests of working class people and the lower elements of the middle class, they instead started to embrace the Dick and Liz Cheneys of the world. CNN highlighting these maniacs like John Bolton, Kamala embracing the genocide in essence in Gaza, and pledging loyal support for the continuation of the proxy war in Ukraine. And people were fed up with the hypocrisy. They understood and saw how the Democrats had used the state, had used the law to go after, as Donald Trump says, their only effective political opposition. And they were disgusted by it. There's a reason why every time Trump got an indictment, his fundraising went through the roof, okay? And Democrats lost more credibility. So it's been a disaster for them. They have nothing to run on as long as they continue to allow themselves to be dominated by the political class that now controls the party. And just recently, my last point on this, now they have these so-called centrists. And when we talk about a centrist, we're really talking about a right-wing person and right-wing elements. They want to run on something they're referring to as the abundance agenda. They're going to completely ignore the so-called left in their party and progressives. And they're going to embrace this idea of an abundance agenda, which basically is a even more clearly articulated commitment to neoliberal economic policies. They think all you got to do is change the label, and you have the ability to push reformism of an economic system that can't be reformed, and then you will be all right. It's a recipe for disaster, but as long as they control the party and have the resources to do that, then the party is going to continue to head toward inevitable collapse.
Folks, my guest is Ajamu Baraka. He's a former Green Party vice presidential candidate in 2016. He's with Black Agenda Report, also Black Alliance for Peace, and El Dom, the Hunter pardon is unusually extensive for 10 years back. You're absolutely right, but that's how far back Joe had to go in order to see to it that a lot of the crimes that may have been created during the Obama administration, and while they were all making money in Ukraine, would have to be covered. And Zach says, if Hunter's name was Jamal and not Hunter, he would have been given 20 years in prison. And yes, we did make mention of the name of Leonard Peltier. Daniel says that Black voters must be outraged, and you're absolutely right there. But the question is, it's one thing to be outraged, but where do you channel that ire? Where do you channel that outrage? To just sit at home and scream in the dark, what is that going to do for you? That I think is important. And you mentioned Ajamu, the Democrats taking the position on Gaza that they've taken, and that takes me to the Amnesty International report. You feel like you are subhuman. Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And let me just read a little bit from this. On October 7, 2023, Israel embarked upon a military offensive on the occupied Gaza Strip of unprecedented magnitude, scale, and duration. Since then, it has carried out relentless aerial and ground attacks, many of them with large explosive weapons. This report focuses on the Israeli authorities' policies and actions in Gaza as part of the military offensive they launched in the wake of the Hamas-led attacks on October 7th, while situating them within the broader context of Israel's unlawful occupation and system of apartheid against Palestinians. This is to me, incredibly telling report, also because it doesn't frame the argument in the typical Western narrative as though everything started on October 7th and Israel had no choice, that Hamas is a bunch of terrorists, and they don't take that standard party line. Ajamu Baraka.
Well, that is important, and was also significant about that report too, is that unlike many of the other commentary coming from human rights organizations and even structures within the United Nations, they didn't dance around what we have been seeing with our own eyes. That is, using language like Israel is engaged in activities that could be seen as genocide, might be genocide, et cetera, et cetera. They said basically this is genocide, and they included the most damaging element of that in terms of the prosecution and punishment of genocide. They said it was also with genocidal intent. Many of these formations tried to get around that. They will suggest that while Israel may be engaged in activities that look like it could be genocide, there's no real intent. Well, the Amnesty report is laying out in excruciating detail the intent, very similar to what we saw that was contained within the South African case that went to the International Court of Justice that they're still deliberating on, to demonstrate that the actions of the Israeli authorities in Gaza were intentional. That is, they targeted this ethnic group for murder, for ethnic cleansing, for undermining the ability to replicate themselves by targeting women and children, by starvation, by systematic psychological torture. They were engaged in policies of, in fact, extermination. And that is the difference between before and today. And it has huge implications, Dr. Leon, because we fully expect that when the International Court of Justice renders its findings, it's impossible for them to render a finding very different than what we've seen with this Amnesty report and with other reports. Even though they may not want to call it genocide, the International Court of Justice recognizes that under the provisions of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, that Israel is in fact guilty. And so, what does that mean for U.S. authorities? Because there's a very explicit provision in that convention that says that states that enable and support genocide are in fact complicit and are open up for prosecution also. So it's a very, very serious implication for U.S. authorities also, but also politically. What does that say for people who, in essence, gave their support to this genocide, who cheered on the genocide? You know, it has implications politically, morally, and culturally that we're just beginning to see the consequences of.
And again, going back to the Chinese idea of the longer term view, the moral arc of history is long and it bends towards justice, as Dr. King would tell us. We may not be able to truly appreciate the significance as we're sitting here talking about this now, but as we look at an empire in decline, this could have an incredibly important impact as we get further down the historic trail. Daniel, thank you so much for that super sticker. And you are more than welcome to thank you for bringing on Ajamu Baraka. And folks, if you have questions directly for him, such as Rampelsense, what about all the Black folks in jail by Kamala and having 20 years of marijuana? Yeah, well, that was, going back to her issues as a prosecutor. There were a number of reasons for a lot of people to be less than pleased. I mean, look at the fact that when she ran in 2020, she was the first one out the race. Tulsi Gabbard blasted her out the room, and she didn't even get 2% of she got 0 delegates and less than 2% of the vote. So all of this whole thing about she earned it, and I know we're switching gears back, but I just, that was a very good point that I wanted to highlight. So, the fact that, no, she wasn't beloved in the community, not even in Oakland. And I'm from Sacramento, so I know I got my finger on some of what's happening in Oakland, since as a child, I spent a lot of time growing up there. It wasn't, the reality wasn't the vision that was painted.
Right. It's really unfortunate that unfortunate for the Democrat Party that they don't really understand what happened with this candidate. I mean, look, most of our people are not going to be thrilled with a prosecutor, because so many of our families have been impacted by state actions, they're impacted by unfair prosecutions. So that was an element that was not going to be, they weren't going to be able to transcend. And the result has been now that if, from their point of view, they stuck with this Trump administration. But as you said earlier in one of your questions, we are not thinking about the long term. That basically we have opportunities now with the implosion taking place within the Democrat Party to really move politics forward in terms of the electoral arena. And as you said, if people would have been able to overcome this fear mongering and given their vote based on principles, and given it to, say, a Stein campaign, and the campaign would receive 8, 10, 12% of the vote, it would have been a revolutionary development and set the stage for the national politics that's going to unfold in 2028. But it also would have set the stage for a new thrust on the state and local levels in terms of challenging the two-party monopoly on the state levels, something that people don't think about that often. We get our attention focused or directed to national politics and almost forget that some of the most significant legislation that impacts our lives directly is taking place at the state and local levels. So this is where we are today. We have enormous opportunities, but Dr. Leon, we have to have clear political direction, clear politics, and we can't allow I'm speaking now for those of us who are involved with the Black Alliance for Peace, for example. We're not going to allow our people to be manipulated into a focus just on so-called Trump and Trumpism, and give the neoliberal Democrats a pass. Because when you do that, you are inadvertently propping up the Democrats and their neoliberal, anti-people, and anti-democratic policies and politics. And so we stuck back again with, this lesser of two evils things. We have an opportunity once we survive Trump, and we will survive Trump, to finally transcend those politics, because we're going to survive Trump, and when we survive Trump, people will realize that we can engage in a different kind of politics, and the world won't end, and that's going to undermine a significant weapon that the Democrats are holding today.
You mentioned 2028, but also you got 2026, which would be the midterms. And after this shellacking that the Democrats took, and I'd like for you to now elaborate on this implosion that we're seeing within the party. In listening to Hakeem Jeffries on Meet the Press, talking about, well, now we have to do our kind of after action report. Dude, you just got your hind parts whooped. There's not a whole lot of after action. I haven't heard the Democrat. To me, they need to be focusing, telling people now, we heard you. We got the message. Here are the 4 things that we're going to be focusing on from this point forward. And those things need to be addressing the realities that are facing the American people, the poor and the working class, particularly in this country. And so with that as a premise, we open the show talking about Agenda 47, Donald Trump, the Donald Trump redo or redux. What are we to look towards now as this whole Agenda 47 starts to take hold, and Donald Trump is going to be wreaking havoc as he's wreaking havoc?
Well, there are a lot of elements in that so-called agenda that, of course, require congressional support, and that's not really going to happen. I think that the legislative agenda of Trump will be relatively narrow. That what we're going to have is a politics of paralysis, and that the only legislation that will get passed would be the legislation that really impacts and really supports the most powerful forces in the country.
Wait a minute. Politics of paralysis. Many would say he's got the Supreme Court. He is the executive branch. He's got the Senate. He's got the House. Where do you see the paralysis coming from?
The 60 votes you need in the Senate.
Okay. Okay.
We got to remind people that the so-called founders put these structures in place on purpose, and they in fact work in terms of preventing sweeping radical changes. And people have to be reminded, because all this loose talk about dictatorship and all of that, it just doesn't work in this U.S. system. I mean, you know, so you have to sweep everything away, and that they're not prepared to sweep the entire thing away. So yes, so they have the executive.
Wait a minute. One more.
Yes, sir.
Data point to that, and that is going back to Steve Bannon in 2016, talking about we're here to deconstruct the administrative state. That, I think, went over the head of a lot of people. Can you factor that into the point that you just made?
Yes, that now they have a chance to really, in fact, do that. One of the lessons that they learned from the first administration was that because they didn't have the personnel to come in and actually seize hold of the administrative state and to even control completely the executive, they were dependent on all the traditional Republican elements to come in and help with the administration. And Trump discovered that those elements were more loyal to the Republican elites than to his agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But this time around, they're not doing that,
Mm-hmm.
as we all can see. He's
Mm-hmm.
bringing in loyalists to shake up the government, to deconstruct the administrative state, if you will, to in fact transform the state. And again, it's like you were saying earlier, with a eye toward the future,
Mm-hmm.
because they know that they may not be able to pass a lot of legislation, but using the executive orders, being able to make administrative changes within the bureaucracies, being able to maybe even eliminate certain departments, they are laying the foundation for the continuation of this agenda that they have, a more explicit right-wing agenda than even the neoliberal Democrats. But understand this, in my opinion, this is just laying the foundation for what I refer to as the politics of convergence. That basically we're heading toward a parallel position toward the right that will intersect pretty soon. And it may even intersect during the course of this Trump administration. But what we're going to have, unfortunately, Dr. Leon, before things get better, we're going to have full-blown, obvious fascism in the U.S. We already have fascism to a certain extent. It's targeted and limited, but that is almost an inevitable stage unless there is an effective left opposition that can be organized and organized relatively quickly. And unfortunately, that's going to take some efforts. And I don't think we're going to be able to starve it off for the next couple of years.
How do you see this movement to stifle debate? That when we look at, for example, we have the Uhuru Three and Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and the Uhuru Three going to be sentenced on the 16th of this month in Tampa. We know what happened to Scott Ritter. We know what happened to Danny Shaw in Chicago and his detention for 3 or 4 hours at O'Hare. Professor Dan Kovalik in Miami at the airport. So there seems to be a incredibly concerted effort to tamp down on dissent, especially through social media. How does that factor into this? And how does that make the organizing even more difficult?
Well, let's also point out the fact that all of this you just referred to, that is objectively true, all happened under the Democratic administration.
Correct.
That's going to continue. That kind of censorship is going to continue. That kind of repression will continue and intensify, because now the Trumpian forces were opposed to censorship in social media because it was impacted them also. Now that they are in a stronger position, we're going to see spaces like X become more repressive as it relates to the so-called left and progressive forces. We're going to see, and we already see part of that so-called Agenda 47, a clampdown on states and local school administrations to rid themselves of what so-called critical race theory, which is all nonsense. Nobody's really teaching that on those levels. That's a college level phenomenon. But the working on and working off of the kind of ideological justifications that the Democrats made for big brotherism, the Republicans will continue, and it's going to be very, very difficult for us to operate in. And many people don't have experience operating in repressive environments. In fact, we're so dependent on the technology that we don't even know. We're going to have. It's going to take almost a half a generation for people to relearn how you organize face to face, block to block, in a new kind of way, without the kind of access to technology that we currently have. So it's going to be difficult. That's why I was suggesting that, unfortunately, we're not going to be in a position to effectively oppose this convergence politics taking place for a little while. We can slow it up, and I think we will. But unless we're able to really consolidate more effective left, a left that has labor together with the anti-imperialists and pro-peace people and climate justice activists, et cetera, and it's going to be difficult for us to mount an effective opposition. And the reason for that too is because the Democrat Party funders and NGOs have basically bribed these elements that could be in opposition reducing them to a single issue groups, still dependent on the largesse from the Democrat Party, and that kind of division will continue, unfortunately, until we get it together.
And quickly, you've made reference to convergent politics. If you could define that, please.
It is a parallel a move toward the right, coming from neoliberal Democrats or people related to the Democratic Party.
Thank you,
and
Bill
the Trump,
Clinton.
yes, and the Trumpian forces related to the Republican Party. But it's all going to converge or intersect with a more full-blown, obvious kind of fascist, neo-fascist politics in this country. So this notion that the Democrats represent a counter to the move to the right is all nonsense, because the Democrats have been moving to the right for the last, as you said, the last 30-something years, and that movement has been even accelerated during the Clinton campaign, but even more so with this failed and flawed and really pretty silly attempt on the part of Democrats to embrace the Liz Cheneys and Dick Cheneys of the world. But people have to understand that the neoliberals that emerged under Ronald Reagan, they migrated into the Democrat Party.
Mm-hmm.
So that party has been taken over by these right-wing neoliberals, and these are fascists.
And so when you look at Trump trying to bring the Matt Gaetzes of the world into power, this guy that whose own mother accused him of being, how much of this is distraction? And I even wondered how much of this is Trump throwing those guys out there as stalking horses in anticipation of them being attacked, so that he could then propose a slightly less egregious version. And Lil Marco Rubio as going to be with Secretary of State. I mean,
yes.
Your thoughts. What signals do you get from people like this?
I think those two examples that you just laid out as stalking horses, I think that's probably valid. But if he could have pushed Matt Gaetz through, he would have done that.
He would have done it.
He would have done it, because basically, again, deconstructing the administrative state, exacting some revenge using the same weapons that were used against him, and to expose what he sees as the big scandal, and that is the infiltration of his campaign and the undermining of his administration by the intelligence agencies of the U.S. So it was real. Now, there's other one for the Defense Department. I think you'll see. I think we're going to see him being dumped also pretty quickly.
And which we know Donald Trump doesn't like losing those kinds of conflicts. Does that signal anything to you about Republican pushback?
No, I think that it was a risky thing to put them out and then not push it through. But I think people recognize, as you just said in your question, that this is probably more kind of messing with folks than something real.
Brother Ajamu Baraka, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your joining us today, sharing your incredible intellect. Folks, this brother right here, as you can tell, is nothing but brilliant. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to get into some other things. All that means is I got to bring you back.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. As you all know, I got a meeting to go to now. I got to go meet with the FBI. And I'll, short of anything catastrophic, I'll be able to tell you tomorrow how this whole thing went down. Stay tuned for new episodes every day. Please follow, please subscribe, please review, share the show. Follow on social media. You'll find all the links to the show in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you tomorrow, God willing. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.